Let's talk about the process of succession. So, broadly, succession is what happens when there's an environmental disturbance that kind of fucks up the whole ecosystem, and the whole ecosystem has to kind of factory reset. So, there's kind of two-ish main types of succession. There's this one, which is primary succession. This is when the ecosystem basically has to start from scratch due to a large environmental change that leaves no dirt, no plants, no nothing, just kind of bare rock. This happens in the case of something like a large rock slide, glacial retreat, or something like a very large volcanic eruption that leaves basically just volcanic rock and ash. There's also secondary succession, which is the less severe of the two. This is something like forest fires, floods, mudslides, anything like that, where most of the plant matter is destroyed, but it still leaves a good layer of soil and underground plant and organic matter, so it doesn't have to restart entirely 100% from scratch. Now, after this environmental disturbance, there's a kind of set approximate order of things that happen. In the case of primary succession, where there's basically just bare rock left over, the first things to start taking over, the first living organisms to develop other than like microbes, are things like lichen. So lichens are like weird organisms that is a symbiotic relationship between fungi and algae that just are together in the same thing, and they form that. They will grow pretty much anywhere they can, including but not limited to bare rock with pretty much zero nutrients. These lichens provide the kind of organic base that is necessary for other things to grow. They provide a base for something like moss to come and start to grow on the rocks and like start to establish and create soil, in which case larger things can start to grow. In the case of secondary succession, there is still a base of dirt, so the lichen isn't really the first step. It's kind of already established and you don't need to like make your own soil. There's already a base for other things to grow, so you can kind of just skip to the second step of the process, which is small vascular plants, including wildflowers and grasses. There is also moss that can start growing here too, but that's more the case in primary succession, where they start growing on top of the lichen and the small bits of soil that lichen generate. In the case of secondary succession, these plants can pretty much just start growing right away as soon as there's like a rainfall and water in the soil, because lots of the time there's stored plant seeds already just in the soil. Like the grasses and wildflowers will drop their seeds, and depending on the type of disturbance, they can just start growing right away. In the case of something like a wildfire, it may take a little bit longer just because the seeds may be further down and more damaged, but there's already established seeds in the established dirt. In the case of primary succession and some forms of secondary succession, it takes a little bit longer because lots of the time the plants rely on the wind as distribution. So if there's been something like a rock slide or volcanic eruption, there's no seeds that are already in the soil, so they have to rely on wind to transport seeds from elsewhere to get into that area and grow on that soil. So primary succession does take quite a bit longer in pretty much every case. But in either way, once there are seeds from these small wildflowers and grasses, they can start to grow and start to establish organic matter. These also need to be able to do well in nutrient-poor soil, especially in the case of primary succession, where the soil doesn't have that much basis to begin with. In secondary, it's a little bit easier because oftentimes there's still nutrients present in the soil, and in case of something like a flood or mudslide, there may even be excess nutrients that were deposited in the soil from that disturbance. But either way, these guys live, they die, they do the whole life cycle thing, and when they're done, all of the nutrients from their decomposition goes into the soil to add more essential like chemicals and minerals and all that. Then later comes along the trees. Now, these can also come from either in the soil or deposited by wind, depending on where it is, but the trees that start tend to be, again, better suited to nutrient-poor soil, and they also tend to be very fast-growing. These are things that are mostly evergreen, like pines. Pines do very well in early succession stages. These plants are also usually very sunlight tolerant because there's not any shade coverage or anything. These trees, as well as the early wildflowers and grasses, there's a lot of very direct sunlight, so they need to be able to tolerate that, and as well as no wind coverage. And during these two earlier stages as well, that's also when the wildlife starts to return to the area. First being like bugs and invertebrates, then birds, and then you get to larger mammals like rabbits and deer and all of that. As these early successional trees grow, they get taller, they tend to block out the sunlight, so the very early plants such as the wildflowers and the grasses that are less shade tolerant, they tend to die off and make way for plants that are more shade tolerant, such as many ferns. Then the trees mature and all that, but those early trees tend to be shorter lived, so they don't live for quite as long as some other trees, and that gives way to many long-lived trees that can get to be very old, like a bunch of oak. As these guys mature, they again grow, they shade out, and they develop an established canopy. So it switches from a young forest to an old forest, or old growth forest, where many of the trees have been there for a very, very long time, and the ecosystem doesn't change very much in these later stages. And then that is when you get a climax ecosystem, which is basically a ecosystem in equilibrium, essentially, where all of the trees and plant life has been there for a very long time. Not many new species are coming in and out, and you can get some trees that are really, really old, kind of like the California redwoods. That is a climax ecosystem because they have been there for a long time with very little change. And usually that climax ecosystem will stay there indefinitely until there's another environmental disturbance, such as a forest fire or a flood or something, that will basically restart the whole process back to an either primary or secondary stage. Now, obviously, the species and things that happen do tend to vary between ecosystems depending on what the disturbance is and where it happens in the world, but this is kind of the general process in which this takes, because that's what makes the most sense environmentally, is what the different species are adapted to do in these situations. Each species has a different set of conditions that they're the best adapted for. And so this just kind of shows that pretty much no matter what happens, the environment has its own ways of recovering.